Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the first episode of Worn Shoes. I'm glad you're here. In this episode, I interview Grace, who grew up in Indonesia and moved to the United States for school to pursue a degree in psychology. We talk about her life growing up in Indonesia and then transitioning to the US, about food, lifestyle, culture, and mental health. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Please stick around towards the end as I have a couple announcements for everyone. Enjoy! Hey Gracia, welcome to Worn Shoes. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good today. Thanks for
Yeah?
asking. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate you being here. I know you through the same school that we went to, Covenant College, and you are a good friend of my wife, Michelle.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. I had seen you around before we started dating, but I didn't really get to know you until afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, I was in your wedding for sure.
Yeah, you were one of the bridesmaids not too long ago.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so to start off, can you tell me where all you have lived and the places you visited and kind of where you consider yourself to be from? Yeah, just tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, like visit as like a vacation visit?
Sure.
Okay, so I was born in Indonesia and like I technically grew up most of my time in like 20 minutes from Jakarta. So it's like the suburbs of Jakarta called Tangerang. But I was actually born on a different island,
Okay.
and we kind of like, yeah, I moved around at least 15 times.
Oh
Like,
wow.
no, 7 times around Indonesia, just all over, and kind of settled finally in Tangerang. Yeah, so that's kind of where, I was born and raised, and I grew up, not grew up, but I visited, other Asian countries such as like Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong and China and
Yeah.
that part. Had some layovers in Japan and Korea and Qatar.
Yeah.
And then also lived for about like a month in Sydney, Australia, actually,
Oh
because my
wow.
step aunt and my step uncle actually lives there. So I was
Yeah.
there for a good time, actually. And then went to the United States in Look Around in Georgia for 4 years in Covenant, then moved to Atlanta, and then potentially moving, not potentially, I am moving to Washington, D.C. this coming fall. So yeah, I've been almost in every parts except for like basically Europe and South America and Africa, but generally everything else have
And
been like, kind of touched here and there.
yeah, I mean that's a pretty large chunk of the world, I would say.
Sometimes I forget how big Asia is. I'm just like, oh, it is
Yeah,
huge.
most of the world's people live in Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah,
It's crazy.
way overpopulated, but yes.
So you mentioned that you moved a lot around in Indonesia.
Yep, and I live like without traffic, it's like 20 minutes, the
Okay.
suburbs of Jakarta, yeah, so Tangerang.
What did your daily life look like living close to Jakarta? In terms of like schooling and getting around, I guess what ages did you live in Indonesia?
Basically like my entire life,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
specifically in Tangerang, like from when I was 6 until I had to go to college. So like a really,
Okay.
really good chunk of my
Yeah,
life.
gotcha. Yeah, so I mean that's a large chunk, but yeah, tell me about what did your kind of daily life look like maybe in middle school. We'll start there.
Oh, middle school. Yeah. So middle school, that's when I transitioned from a international Montessori school to more of like a public school-ish, but not really. So it's called National Plus system. So it's like a hybrid within English and Indonesian.
Okay.
Fun fact, actually, I could not speak Indonesian in middle school, at least for the first year.
Oh,
So with Indonesian, there's
yeah,
like different like not like formality, and I
right.
really did not know formal Indonesian. Like what in my household, like at home, my grandma taught me English. Most of like my media consumption was in English,
Gotcha.
and I would say things to my parents in English, but they'll respond back in a mix of Indonesian and my mom's dialect, Javanese. So I never really like spoke formal Indonesian, if it
Gotcha.
was necessary. In my former schooling, we also like, I spent 8, 9 hours of the day basically speaking in English, so I only
Right.
spoke Indonesian at home. So that was really interesting. I remember I,
Yeah.
I couldn't understand like the grammar and certain, like I remember like, like in Indonesian, like you have the article to describe a person and a fruit is like two different things, right? And I remember using the article to use to describe a fruit to a person. And
Oh.
like everybody, remember like everyone was like, "What?" And I'm like, "Oops." So
Aw.
yeah, so because of that huge transition, I really struggled a
Yeah.
lot in school, which is like,
Gotcha.
I think like something that a lot of my friends here in the States did not expect. So like day to day is I don't remember on top of my head what time did I start middle school. I feel like
Yeah.
it's definitely early, like between the 7, 8 o'clock
Right.
range.
Yeah.
Um, so that's what I did. School was still in Tangerang. I think the best part of Tangerang is it has a lot of the facilities of Jakarta
Hmm.
without the traffic of Jakarta.
Gotcha.
And so like school was super close at that time, but a lot further than my elementary school, like primary school. So it was like a 10, 15. My mom will take me to school with her car. And it's like super common to just like have your parents like drop you off and pick you up until like you basically finish high school.
Yeah.
It's super, super common. And of
Gotcha.
course, like my parents have a tendency to pack me lunch, but there's also the school cafeteria if like I really wanted something snacky, cravey, unhealthy, basically. And yeah, started then. We'll be in school until like around like 2, 3. I think it was until like more like 3 o'clock. I think I kind of forgot honestly middle school. Wow, it's been
Yeah.
a while. And then I'll go to tutoring because I needed a lot of help. So
And that
I'll
was
be
tutoring in Indonesian to kind of help.
yeah, like understanding. It's like for like math, physics,
Gotcha. Yeah.
chemistry, history, economics, but in Indonesian.
Okay.
So like basically for all subjects kind of thing, but mostly I did for like math, physics, and like those kind of like more like mathematical ones that requires kind of thing. A lot of like the
Okay.
memorization and stuff like that, I was actually fine, which is weird.
Yeah.
So yeah, I will be in tutoring for like sometimes it goes from like 3 to like 6, 7 o'clock.
Oh
Sometimes
wow.
it's usually, and then sometimes it can go up to like 9 o'clock. And then I'll go home. I'll do some kind of extra work, and then I'll go to bed at like 11. So it's like
Yeah.
11 to 6, kind of my day to day, and it's
Yeah.
basically it. Like it's a
Yeah.
lot of like
A lot
not
of
adhering
school.
a lot of school, yeah, that's a
Hmm.
very like I think that was like my biggest shock in comparison to Montessori, where like Montessori, like you literally like have the freedom to create your schedule
Yeah.
and like learn different things. And I really enjoyed school during like my time when I was in Montessori. And now that I find out as I grew older, as someone with ADHD, like it makes sense why
Hmm.
that environment
Right.
was more fitting for me. And like
Yeah.
it's funny because
Yeah.
I was like, I discussed things with my parents and they're like, yeah, we didn't know that, that was the environment that was actually really helpful for kids with ADHD without the fact of
Hmm.
knowing our kid had ADHD.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, that was kind of my day. My life today is basically wake up, school, study, wake up, school, study. And I feel like
Yeah.
that never really stopped until I graduated high school. And it actually got worse in high school. Yeah.
Yeah, so something you mentioned a little earlier that was kind of interesting was you talked about speaking Indonesian and English at home with your grandparents and parents. So you spoke English at home with your grandparents and parents? Am I understanding that?
Yeah, I spoke to them. So my grandma, she is extremely fluent in
Okay.
English and she also like speaks like 7 other languages.
Oh
She's
my
like,
gosh.
yeah, and she like learned it herself kind of person.
Wow.
And so she really wanted me to learn English. And because I honestly don't remember when I started speaking English, and my grandma kind of just like refined my grammar more.
Yeah.
But I remember it was definitely like Disney Channel and also like book influence. So I
Yeah, yeah.
love like reading little like children's books. So
Right.
a lot of like, I guess like my language consumptions that is not verbal was English.
What's the main language of Indonesia? I assume it's Indonesian, but is
Yes.
Is English like, I know that some countries have multiple primary languages. Is that the case in Indonesia or not so
Yeah, so the
much?
national language is Indonesian, and then each
Okay.
region has a dialect, which is like really different. And then like English is like I feel like because I was fortunate enough to went to like a Montessori school,
Yeah.
but I think if I'm not mistaken, for like even the public school, like it's like there is like an English class. So
Okay.
like
Yeah.
a common trait of Indonesians is they understand English, but they can't speak English, which is really
Okay.
interesting. And I
Yeah.
feel like something that it's maybe just how English is learned to be very not it's not as not I wouldn't say fluent, but it's I guess it's a little bit more legalistic. It's like a lot like oh these are the grammar rules and stuff like
Right.
that. So it's less Indonesians really struggle to just have the courage to be conversational, I guess, because it's so
Interesting.
past, present, stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I didn't learn any of that kind of stuff. It just kind of like seems like the dictionary in my head kind of thing.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I spoke to my parents in English. I did speak to them in Indonesian, but in Indonesian, informal Indonesian, and my mom's dialect. Uh,
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what is the difference between informal and formal Indonesian, and then what was your mom's dialect?
so my mom spoke Javanese, and it's so funny because I didn't understand it, but just she just says it like when like your parents say things so repeatedly, and then they're like you
Yeah.
understand ended up being able to speak and
Right.
understand the language. It's because she forgets that like my dad and I cannot speak it. So now both my dad and I understands it really well, like pretty well, I would
Yeah.
say. I'm more fluent in it than my dad because my dad just speaks another dialect, so I feel like there's just two things going on.
And is this like a regional Indonesian, and it's just like from where they grew up and the places they came, it's just a regional dialect. So
Hmm.
it's not an accent, but it's like
An
diff
actual
an
separate
actual
language.
separate language. Wow. That's crazy.
Hmm. And so like I did not know like that those were like because like I remember like this is so funny. So back in Covenant, I was in linguistics, and Dr. Hector used Javanese as an example of one of the
Oh, okay.
questions. And I'm like, wait, you consider this as a separate language? So I remember on how I know that we were learning like phonemes and all that stuff. And
Right.
I remember how I answered the question was I just tried to remember on how my mom says it,
Yeah.
which ended up being the correct answer. But it's just like funny. It's like I didn't like,
Yeah.
it was just like, oh, interesting. And yeah, that was kind of like the pool that I was in. So I spoke in, I honestly, what I think, like, kind of remember, but like, I think my parents would know this better than I do. But
Yeah.
like, it was definitely informal Indonesian with my mom's Javanese that are very used interchangeably,
Mm-hmm.
and then jumping in English sentences. And somehow it's so funny because my mom was like, "Oh, I don't understand English," but she understand what I was trying to say.
Right.
So I feel like my parents need to give a little bit credit to themselves a little bit. But yeah, that's kind of like the conversations that I had with my family. But definitely like 90% English with my grandma,
Gotcha.
and she tries to be like mostly English because at that time she really believed in like for me to have like better like a more refined grammar in a sense. And I feel
Hmm.
like having being in Montessori where English is the primary language
Yeah.
spoken, like it just kind of like not amplifies it, but it kind of solidifies the different linguistic multilingualness of my head. Yeah. But I do know for sure that I was a late speaker in general.
Hmm.
So I only started talking when I was like 3.5 and 4, I think, if I'm not
Oh wow. Yeah.
mistaken. And then we find out now, through like just learning and as a psychologist, definitely because of those
Hmm.
different languages contributing, I wasn't
Yeah.
late, just
Yeah.
processing different things.
There's just like three or four languages going on around
Yeah.
as opposed to one. Yeah, that reminds me of a little bit in Azerbaijan where people who are especially in their 30s and 40s will use Russian and Azerbaijani interchangeably just because they grow up in the Soviet Union. And so they'll
Hmm.
just like start a sentence in one language and end it in another. And then there's like dialects and stuff too. So
Yeah.
just that situation of just like there's languages flying everywhere around and you're trying to process it and figure it out. Yeah, so you talked about, yeah, going to school and some of the food there and, wanting to get some snacks or from the cafeteria and both your parents being from different regions in Indonesia. Can you tell me a little bit about the cuisine of Indonesia and what did you eat at home? What did you eat at school? So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so another fun fact is I'm Chinese Indonesian.
Oh,
So that changes a lot of the food that I eat for sure. My dad is actually like we will assume as more like half. So my grandpa is native Indonesian. My
okay.
grandma is Chinese. My mom's
Okay.
parents are both mostly Chinese.
Okay.
So I ate a lot of Chinese Indonesian food.
Okay.
So Chinese Indonesian food is really interesting because I will associate my mom's home cooking to be very Chinese Indonesian.
Hmm.
So a lot of stir fry, lots of rice in general. I think it's such a very
Yeah.
typical Asian thing.
What were some of your favorite meals, I guess? Yeah,
Oh
that
my
your
gosh.
mom packed or that you ate or yeah, just had in and around.
So my mom is just like the best cook in the world, in my opinion, because she also makes really good Korean food actually, and makes really great pasta. So she always just makes everything.
Yeah.
But my favorite kind of food from her is, I think it's like basically pan deep fry, like battered shrimp, and then like watercress stir fry with like shallots and garlic and rice. It's like the most cheapest, but also most delicious, wholesome meal in
That
my opinion.
that sounds really good.
And or calamari, she deep fried it and then have that. I love that vegetable, that watercress. I don't know. I think it's
Is it
called watercress,
okay?
but it's basically spinach, but it's not. It's a type of spinach, but I haven't seen it sold in the United States unless I go to the
Okay.
Asian market. It has like
Gotcha.
more of like it has like like a thicker stem and it's like longer in shape than regular like spinach.
Yeah.
But it's a
Interesting.
form of a spinach for sure,
Hmm.
I think. Yeah, like there's like, like people say like children hates vegetables, but that's like the
Hmm.
one vegetable you can ask almost every Indonesian that they somehow love.
Would you say it's like a staple in the Indonesian
It's just such a
diet or?
classic. So like you'll have that as a side with like deep fried fish or
Mm,
grilled fish. I think it's what's really common in like an Indonesian and I feel like generally an Asian meal. You have some kind of protein, and that's usually the vegetable that goes with it with rice.
interesting.
That's
Yeah.
just such a. I think growing up, like that's kind of what my mom did. It's just a combo of those three, just different formats
Mm-hmm.
of it. But of
Hmm.
course, I like that specific vegetable the most, like that specific spinach the most, and like so she'll just change up the protein. Another thing that I love is this is a very Chinese Indonesian dish. So it's like pork with tofu with like oyster sauce, soy sauce, garlic, and onions and stuff like that, and kind of marinate it. And then you'll have shrimp crackers with it with rice.
Oh
I
my
love those.
gosh.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
crackers is such a common thing. It's the thing. Um, and then there's one thing, my mom can't make this, but oh my gosh, I've been going to the same restaurant, like same place for the past like since I was 6.
Oh
So I've
wow.
been a regular then. So I'm excited
Yeah.
to go there when I get back.
Yeah.
It's basically deep fried fish balls.
Caviar?
No, deep fried,
Oh.
not fish balls. Like fish cakes, deep fried fish cakes
Oh, okay. Okay.
that has a duck boiled egg in the center, and
Oh
then
wow.
the sauce that you eat it with is basically a sweet vinegar sauce, and yeah, you eat it like that. You kind of like dip it, like
Yeah.
that's such an Indonesian thing that I haven't found something that can describe as close to that. That is my favorite food.
Yeah. That
Like,
sounds really good.
and then something that's super common with my family is eating out is actually cheaper than cooking in. So we have breakfast, like pork noodles for breakfast, and that's super, super common. And I really, really miss that. And also dumplings. Like I really miss that. Yeah, those are like a few of like, oh, another thing that must a shout out. My two, see, like I have a huge list, but like I like anything that's fried. I think you can. There's three things.
Yeah.
I love basically, like we have fried rice, but there's
Mm-hmm.
fried. It's called kwetiao. It's fried rice noodles, but not like the
Okay.
vermicelli one, like pad thai. No, it's a lot
Right.
thicker and it's a lot chewier.
Hmm.
And then it's amazing. It's like with eggs and like it's basically fried rice, but better in my opinion. And then yellow fried chicken. So you kind of like steep the chicken with like turmeric and then cardamom and all that stuff for
Yeah.
like 3 hours, and then you deep fry it. And you can use that same kind of marinade for catfish. So I really like deep fried catfish too with rice.
Interesting.
And of
Yeah.
course the sambal.
Yeah. No, it sounds like there's a lot of fish, which I guess Indonesia is an island, and there's a lot of islands surrounding it, so that it seems obvious that that would be a large part of
Yeah,
the
seafood is
cuisine.
super, super seafood and fish, and of course, like because I'm Chinese, pork is a
Right.
huge factor. And like my dad loves to fish, and so he goes to
Oh,
fishing
wow.
all the time. So like he'll bring home like a rat snapper or something like that. So I think I am fortunate enough to say that I had great seafood growing up for
Yeah.
real.
Yeah.
So yeah, my the diet is yeah mostly fish, chicken, and pork for me personally. I don't really
Good.
eat a lot of beef. Yeah.
Have you been able to, in Chattanooga or in Atlanta, been able to find any good Indonesian restaurants or?
There's one in Atlanta. There's two in Atlanta, but I like one over the other a bit more.
Okay.
Really good friends with the owner, and I would
Oh,
say
cool.
the flavor is actually very authentic in my opinion. Yeah, it's yeah, in Chattanooga, sadly no. Most of the time I
Yeah.
had to kind of make it myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's one in Atlanta and it's pretty good.
Yeah, so you talked about food and now what about school? I know that you mentioned the middle school you went to. It was kind of busy, from 7 to 8 in the morning, and then you were doing school until maybe even 11 at night, and that only got worse with high school. Can
Mm.
you tell me a little bit about your high school experience and what going to school was like in terms of, yeah, socially and then academically? Yeah, what was that experience kind of like going to, and was it a school in Indonesian or in English?
It was fully Indonesian. So like I
Okay.
guess it's like a transition. So like primary school, elementary was like fully English, and then middle school was more like half and half, but not really
Okay.
half and half. And then high school was just straight on Indonesian. I only
Yeah.
had like one English class and I slept
Yeah.
through it because I feel like we repeat the same things all over all the time. I mean, I think like a lot of people, if they found out where I went for high school, they'll understand my sentiment about it. But high school was
Hmm.
hell and traumatic. So high school,
Hmm.
we start. So I wake up around 5, leave the house around 5:45, and then I start school around at 6:30.
Hmm.
Finish around 4 o'clock, and it goes up to like 11 to 12. Yes. So that was all 3 years. It was very intense. We had like 16 finals for 2 weeks. There's
Wow.
barely breaks between time periods. So in Indonesia, I'm more of like the traditional Indonesian curriculum. So you have to pick
Hmm.
either in social studies and natural sciences. The generic stereotype, and I feel I feel like some stereotypes do stem from like some valid statements. So like
Yeah.
natural science is the more likely you'll be successful and intelligent. So there was no
Yeah.
doubt that I was not allowed to touch the social science section. And it's just like it's understandable, just like the feel and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally I was a natural science major, which changes
Mm-hmm.
things that mean like instead of having one math course, I have two math courses
Right.
on just very, very natural science heavy. And so like we had to take all classes. So I had to, but it's also funny, even though I was a natural science major, history, civics, English, another foreign language, or another extracurriculum was all mandatory. And so so I studied physics, chemistry, biology, like basically everything. um,
Yeah.
yeah, the culture it was definitely like, when you see movies like Korean dramas, Chinese dramas about like the
Hmm.
intensity of school, it's
Yeah.
basically pretty accurate actually.
Yeah.
Of like everyone is just you meet the parents that will not let the kid go home if they got
Hmm.
like a bad grade. That is
Wow.
actually, and it's actually the my school kind of projects, I feel like projects that stereotype really well. It kind of there it's like that's what they've known for too.
Yeah.
They've known to be like that kind of academically rigorous.
Yeah.
Which is like funny because I transitioned to that school based on like my former grade cards, not because like actually like I didn't, some people did like a test entry and stuff. Like I didn't
Right.
do that, and ended up I don't think it was my best choice in life. I
Hmm.
mean, it was also really encouraged by my not my mom per se, but more it was like exciting, like if your
Yeah.
kid's going
Yeah.
to like a prestigious high school. Yeah, so that was like kind of my day to day. We had like 1 hour break, so 15 minutes, and half an hour. And you
Hmm.
should not be surprised when you know there's an exam coming up, people don't really take their breaks and just use it for
Right.
study time. So
Yeah.
that's super, super common. Something that like a lot of me and my current friends now have been like reflecting of like the impacts of those habits now as we enter into our 20s, especially
Yeah.
those who study overseas. Like there was some interesting unhealthy habits that I feel like
Yeah.
we now really have to learn to unlearn in a sense,
Yeah.
because it like, kind of goes to your core too, like what you consider values. So I think something that's very, Indonesia is very collective, very indirect. And it's very
Yeah.
obvious in the education system too.
Yeah.
And I can go on a full spiel about my disagreements about a lot of it. But yeah, something that's really a thing totally witnessed is the hierarchy in social status. That's
Hmm.
something that's really, really high value. Like face value is really, really important. I feel like, in academics and school, the face value is grades.
Yeah.
And it kind of like progresses that. And you can also see how different social status, different economic status really impacts different friend groups, circles too, actually,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
is like really interesting of how it's so implicit but yet so obvious. So like this is like a really bad example, and this is very anecdotal, but like it's not a huge surprise to me if, let's say, this person isn't necessarily the most intelligent, but
Hmm.
the person is, has material like stability and like, seems like a wealthy middle upper class person.
Sure.
Most likely they're not gonna get bullied. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
So it's just like those kind of little things. I don't know if like I answered your question. I feel like I went on a tangent. But like, yeah, it's definitely like the difference in, you can really see, especially in high school for me, like the difference, what knowledge is, what education is. It's definitely, there's a lot of leaning towards what gives the best face value in investment, kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, and so that's why when I went to America, it was like, whew, it's like it was a relief, to be
Hmm.
honest. And so it's
Yeah.
just there's I would say, like living in the US for a pretty good amount of time now actually
Yeah.
kind of makes you have, I don't think this is a surprise, but like kind of having this kind of in the middle kind of situation, where you're like, there's things that I really appreciate about the Indonesian culture,
Yeah.
values, but there's things that I really don't. And
Hmm.
so like kind of like how can I find a good middle ground, especially like let's say like on things that I agree more on, like the American side, like it's
Hmm.
easier to live in America by adhering to those values and like
Hmm.
understanding of how, I guess, to bring that when I go back. So it's just
Yeah.
an interesting new life, I feel like. And also like once you live overseas, it changes of how you view things a lot, in my
Hmm.
opinion. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you tell me about how did you end up finding Covenant? It's pretty far from Indonesia. So how did you end up finding that and getting to Covenant? And then what was that transition like for you?
Yeah, so it's like really Christian answer, but it
Hmm.
that was exactly what happened. So I was
Yeah.
supposed to take architectural design in Germany, studied
Hmm.
the language for a few years because I don't know, a part of me was always like very persistent of finding a way of, I think just because of like learning English first and stuff like that, like I feel like I fit more to a more non-traditional education setting. But now we know,
Hmm.
as I grew up, like,
Yeah.
oh, it's because like my ADHD brain was
Right.
needed that.
Yeah.
And then I found a lot of, a few traumatic incidents happen. And
Hmm.
then I was really curious and I was trying to find answers to solve the solution, basically, or
Hmm.
like just trying to understand my
Yeah.
peers a bit more. And I found this article on emotional suppression.
Hmm.
And I just felt, and then I started digging into different like psychological and neuroscience kind of literature and journals.
Yeah.
And I had this like gut feeling that say like I think this is like my calling.
Hmm.
I don't think Germany was it. My dad almost killed me because he was like, not like literally, but he was like kind of pissed because like we spent years for you to like prepare because I basically just need to do
Hmm.
to do the final college entrance and that's
Right.
it. And
For
then
architectural. Sorry.
design.
Okay. Architecture. Yeah.
And so like okay, like she's like we did all this work, like what happened? And so like and I'm really grateful like my parents didn't expect me to like be an engineer, be a doctor
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I fell in love with psychology, and the stigma
Hmm.
of psychology in Indonesia is like, oh, you're just gonna be like in human resources. That's literally your only career. And I'm like, no, that's not
Gotcha.
completely true.
Right.
Um, and I asked the Lord, I'm like, God, like, where should I go?
Hmm.
Because I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I had like, maybe like this is the Holy Spirit guiding in my head. Like, I just don't think it was Germany, period.
Right.
And when I said amen, I got an email from Covenant. And
Wow.
yeah, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
And somehow had the faith to go with it. And we did
Yeah.
not have the financial means to go. Yet, this is super cliche, but the Lord provided every
Yeah.
single semester.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's how I ended up being in America. And then I found out later that through a former relationship I had, like our mentor's daughter actually went to Covenant.
Oh wow.
So when I was having like counseling, like not counseling, like peer mentoring with her, like she
Yeah.
kind of like mentioned it. And so it's like weird. Like she just mentioned it not because she was like trying to recommend me to go there, but it was like, oh, like my daughter went there. And so it's
Yeah.
weird when like I forgot which one happened first, but I feel like it was very tied in together. I feel like okay, this is way too much covenant. Like what the heck is going on? Like this is
Yeah.
weird. And so yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I ended up being in Covenant. Studied psychology and neuroscience.
Hmm.
And I honestly like because of my cross cultural influence, that actually ended up not only like exciting stuff, but like the master's that I'm gonna pursue this coming
Yeah.
fall. And also like the career choice that I ended up picking is because like it's like witnessing the cross cultural difference, especially in
Hmm.
healthcare.
Yeah.
And kind of when you see both systems from as both as a local and as an international, like you kind of
Yeah.
really see both the pros and cons really really obvious, like it's so vivid in a sense.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's how I ended up being in Covenant Lookout Mountain. it's,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Yeah. That is a crazy story. So yeah, so that's how you ended up at Covenant College, and Lookout Mountain, Georgia. Can you, what was that transition like? Because I mean, you mentioned that you visited, other places in Southeast Asia, and you also mentioned, being to. Did you say you went to Qatar?
Yeah, but this is just for
Okay,
the layovers, but that was
okay,
like
for like.
after that's like after the United States.
Okay, okay,
um
gotcha. Yeah.
so
So had you ever been to the U.S. before?
no
Okay. Yeah. What was that
so
like for you?
I never visited Covenant. And so it's just,
Yeah.
I honestly still like it's not like it's hitting me now. It's weird. Like I
Hmm.
don't know, like how the heck that happened. you know,
Yeah.
had the faith. So because financially my parents couldn't come, so I actually
Yeah.
flown solo to the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. And as you know, it's a 26-hour flight,
Wow.
and
Yeah.
it's like 32 including layovers.
Yeah.
And I remember my first impression, I was in Dallas because that was my first stop before going to Chattanooga.
Mm-hmm.
I remember craving a lemonade, wanting Wendy's, and I was just in utter shock with the portion sizes because I ordered a large. And I was just like, oh, this is so big. So a lot of
Yeah.
how the layout was one of my biggest like shocks in a sense, and also the
Hmm.
bathrooms. That was a big one for me. I was like,
Yeah.
in like Asian bathrooms are very like close from like seat to up to the floor. While in the
Right.
US there's like this gap, right? And
Yeah.
also there's no bidet, so it's like, oh, this is like different.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so when I first came to Covenant, like it was different because I grew up in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Covenant is
Yeah.
definitely not a city.
No.
And I mean like to be honest, I was like in this euphoric like newness and novelty. So it was
Right.
like really
Yeah.
cool. I remember when I first came, and something that really changed about me is I used to hate hikes and trails and anything that
Hmm.
involves nature because I don't like to get sunburned.
Yeah.
Like, tanning is, Asian beauty standards do not like being dark.
Right. Right.
So like I don't like going out in the sun
Mm-hmm.
in any shape or form. And one of my biggest change was definitely like I ended up really enjoying hiking and
Yeah.
like going out. And like I'm not like perfect about it, but like it's
Yeah.
a lot better than how it was. Like,
Hmm.
yeah. So, and also like I guess the detachment of just like the busyness of the city, like that's something that
Hmm.
I've noticed for sure in Covenant. And also just like
Yeah.
being a minority. Like I've
Mm.
always been a minority in Indonesia because I'm Chinese,
Yeah.
but like it's even weirder when you're like, because Covenant is so predominantly white.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also like, I remember one of my biggest cultures, someone actually did not know where Indonesia was and thought it was in South America. And I have like several conversations about this, and I'm
Hmm.
not saying that people are dumb, but I'm like it's just you
Yeah.
feel it even more that you're not from the same area.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
something that's common knowledge to me, it's not common knowledge to them.
Yeah.
Or and vice versa. Like I didn't understand a lot of like terminology and different slangs and
Yeah.
like more like general like English slangs I get, but like
Yeah.
more like regional southern things like I didn't.
Yeah.
And so I think that was like my biggest shock. Of course, food was a big shock. The vending machines was also a big shock for me because it's so uncommon like back home to
Just like
have it.
there weren't any vending machines in
Yeah,
Indonesia, or
Indonesians are not very huge like soda drinkers in general. I
mm,
remember
okay.
I
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to drink soda basically growing up.
Hmm.
Also the types of fruits, like I miss that. Like, you know, I grew
Yeah.
up with like a good variety and then maybe honestly cafeteria food is not a good standard, but like having just bananas and apples is kind of sad. But I there are things I really enjoy, like the air is a lot fresher. People
Hmm.
care less what you wear.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot more like it's more individualistic, you know, like you do your own
Hmm.
thing and you do your things. But I also feel like it was like a second chance for me because like you know, growing up in such an intense high school environment and then you
Yeah.
coming and you have a professor that believes in you and like, you know, till this day Dr. Yu, I owe a lot of who I am right now because of her. Because
Hmm.
she saw me
Yeah.
not because of my grades, not because of my race, not because of my gender, like she saw me as
Yeah.
me.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that I really was happy to be set free of, where it's not
Yeah.
these kind of like face value things, you know. It's like
Hmm.
you're that's when like a lot of things, and also the biggest one is of course like the different perspective in therapy
Hmm.
and how it was so encouraged in Covenant. So it was just really interesting starting. It's funny because like I was a psych major, but I was so scared about it
Hmm.
and kind of like the difference on my own cultural values that has impacted me on how I should view things like, you know, mental health, mental illnesses, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's like a summary, I guess, because I mean it's a lot to be honest, Zach, and
Yeah. No.
that's the
Yeah.
one that's like coming on top of my head.
Thanks for sharing. I think something you said that stuck out to me is just, yeah, kind of there's the collective culture and then the individualistic culture and kind of how that relates to mental illness and kind of the area of psychology. You know, kind of how in Indonesia you mentioned that it's kind of stigmatized of like, oh, you're only going into HR.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to hear a little bit more about how you, having your Indonesian identity and Chinese identity, and then coming here and trying to pursue psychology, just as you studied at Covenant, how did that kind of all intersect and work together? And because, I mean, now you're pursuing your master's, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, how did that kind of all work together? What you're passionate about now and what you're pursuing?
Oh, it makes me want to cry because like
Hmm.
it's like my passion. It's like
Yeah.
literally my passion. So I'm pursuing a Master's of Science in Global Health.
Yeah.
And the goal is to increase accessibility of care, specifically for silent illnesses, such as mental illnesses and autoimmune and immunology stuff,
Yeah.
where like these chronic stuff are not like, it's not as strict as like, oh, you have a cut, you have a wound,
Mm-hmm.
you heal it. You know, chronic illnesses are more long term
Right.
and they're very invisible. And it's like you feel pain, but you don't feel pain. But if you don't take care of your pain, it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
And no one really knows where it's coming from, you
Hmm.
know? So yeah, I think like for me, like as someone, you know, I found out true covenant of having ADHD. That was a big surprise, but also not
Yeah.
really. But also a lot of, I was diagnosed with both, like I'm very vocal about this, you know,
Hmm.
both depression and anxiety and PTSD.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I just remember feeling not alone when I came to the
Hmm.
States because I feel like
Yeah.
I had these emotion, I had these like boxes in my head. They're like, they're like I always see my brain as like this chaotic file tab, and I feel like that's a very ADHD statement. Um,
Yeah.
but like true, especially being a psych major, those file tabs started to have labels,
Yeah.
and it really like helped me process of like the difference of care.
Hmm.
And I am fortunate enough to say that I received a tremendous amount of support and care in Covenant because counseling was free.
Yeah.
My roommate really helped me got through into medications with my limited funds.
Yeah.
And that is highly stigmatized in Indo because like unless you're crazy, you don't go to a psychiatrist.
Hmm.
And actually it's really common, Zach, for like people who have depression, even just depression to be locked up in chains and put in this kind of
Wow.
jail like structures. And that
Like
was
there's like in a jail type of thing, or like in their home.
it's both either in their
Wow.
home, but they're very shunned off the society. And then so like what's the hardest one is like I love sharing what I learn. Like that's something that
Yeah.
educational literacy and health literacy is like my biggest passion. So I share a lot of
Hmm.
these things with my parents.
Yeah.
Understanding how the brain works when it's depressed, what is actually pain, whether it's a
Hmm.
social construct, and that's the biggest difference in the
Yeah.
West. A lot of these illnesses are seen as a medical construct. Well,
Hmm.
in the East and Southeast Asia, at least I can say for sure for Southeast Asia, it's definitely seen as a social construct. So social strategies and social solutions is to treat your mental illness, not through a medical perspective. So hence why going to a
Okay.
therapist,
Right.
those kind of things will not work. And they say like, well, if you're going to counseling and you're just talking, then just have a friend.
Yeah.
And so there's those kind of like difference in
Yeah.
categories. Um, so that was like the biggest difference. And I remember like having back and forth conversations with my parents, and it's still like pretty tricky until now. I mean, my
Yeah.
mom has been so amazing at absorbing all this information, and she's just so
Yeah.
compassionate about it. But like, there's often times where like one of my former teachers was said like, well, like you have ADHD, but yours wasn't bad, and so that's why you didn't have to do the way you do. And I'm like,
Hmm.
no, mine was not as bad. I
Right.
just masked it my entire life.
Right. Yeah.
And
Just because it's not, actively showing, or yeah, doesn't
doesn't
mean
mean
that
it
it's
doesn't.
not there. People have found ways to cope or
Yeah.
handle it.
And
Yeah.
I think something that I don't know if Michelle ever shared this, what for
Hmm.
me, the impact for me was I recently got diagnosed with an autoimmune because of the
Hmm.
accumulation of masking and stress throughout my life.
Wow. Yeah.
And a lot of things that I've said to my friends and something that I really want to do in my career, understanding these. I think there's one thing I really appreciate from the United States is boundaries. That's the
Hmm.
biggest thing that I've learned. That I'm still struggling with. But it does impact on how you treat your mental, like your health in general,
Yeah.
on like how you view, because boundaries really reflect your self-value and like what's your ideology, what is considered important to you.
Yeah.
And it's so common in Asian cultures where like having no boundaries is a good thing,
Hmm.
and you tie that with Christianity. So it's like
Yeah.
kind of this mix of like sacrificial love and not having boundaries as like a good thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
But then it can be really like unhealthy because like, okay, it's
Right.
good for your parents to achieve good grades, and
Yeah.
helping the society and all that stuff, but in the risk of your health.
Yeah.
So I have actually a lot of my former peers actually struggle with a lot of health issues now because of that reason.
Hmm.
And they kind of feel the impacts now. And
Yeah.
so something that I really my passion is to work in a way and this is something that I still struggle. Something that what I've noticed was a common value, especially that was like really encouraged in my high school was like, food is not a necessity. Food is a reward. And no one really says that explicitly,
Yeah.
but a few of my friends have kind of refrained to those kind of statements and those kind of like habits,
Hmm.
having that kind of understanding that food is a reward.
Yeah.
So you'll see people oftentimes skip meals for that
Hmm.
reason.
That
And
kind of, yeah. I was going to say that kind of reminds me of, when you were talking about school earlier and how there's a culture, if there's an exam coming up, people, won't take their breaks and they'll study together. And I was just thinking that, if you're someone who feels really tired, and is like, I gotta take my break, but everybody else is studying,
Mm-hmm.
I could just imagine that would be really hard to kind of break from that, especially in a
Very collective is,
collective culture, right? Yeah.
yeah. So like I think like understanding, what is the identity of self and also being, a person of society and kind of having a healthy middle ground is so crucial in how we should do healthcare. Because I think like the problems with
Yeah.
the United States, it's so individualized that it doesn't get like kind of this like social like this kind of more like collective thing that is actually really
Hmm.
beneficial and vice versa.
Yeah.
And I think hopefully from my well, I really hope, and something that my future professors have been encouraging is like because I was a local, so like
Hmm.
my understanding is I felt as a local,
Yeah.
and it's different when you're a local having and have went abroad because you're not just shoving new information, you
Yeah.
kind of knowing where like the general. I think that has been really helpful, especially in hopefully changing policies in healthcare related stuff because like it's coming from someone who's been in those shoes.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
not just shoving in, like in our classes about like, when helping hurts and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But I feel like because I was a local, like I guess in a sense, like I didn't have the privilege of a foreigner,
Hmm.
which makes me actually understand better of where they're coming from and actually
Yeah.
instead of just adding new information, like why do they believe what they believe? Like what is actually the cause of the stigma? Like
Yeah.
stigma has a source.
Right.
And so like what I've noticed is definitely colonialism impacted the stigma,
Yeah.
and it was like kind of an intentional move because like oh, like going to like medical wards is a Dutch thing because we were colonized
Hmm.
by the Dutch for the longest period of time.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the earlier leaders was like, oh, let's try to distance ourselves from the Dutch as much as we can. I feel like, and that carried true on how we perceive health and medical needs.
Hmm.
A sad fact is actually Indonesia only saw mental illness and mental health as a human rights in actually in 2011. So it hasn't been that long.
Hmm.
And so like
What
this,
it what does that mean, seeing it as a human right? What is
well,
yo?
like they don't see it as like essential.
Okay.
Like they don't
Hmm.
see like I guess like in a sense like the I want to like dig deeper to it because the law is
Right.
also kind of like flaky about it.
Okay.
But like I guess the trickling impact is like I guess the more like black and white answer is like physical health is more important than mental health.
Hmm.
Mental health
Yeah.
is not mental health. Mental health is not even health. It's just you need to control your emotions. And
Hmm.
because we're such
Yeah.
collective cultures, you bet that people don't express, show, or process their emotions. Because
Yeah.
you don't wanna ruin it's like I think there was this interesting we our one of our like clinical classes, there was a question, do you prefer to lie or being angry?
Hmm.
And the only two Asian students in that entire class they prefer not the other person to be angry. Everybody
Hmm.
else, we prefer to lie than creating this harmony.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like I think like the mixture of all that things because it's such a collective culture, it's a shame-based culture. It's so weird. It's both collective, it's also very shame-based, but it's not like
Yeah.
to the extent of like let's say like what people would assume like the East Asian cultures. But also East Asians are actually a lot more individualistic than Southeast Asians, fun fact. But yeah, like a little bit mix of that was definitely the biggest like we're just so the communication clouds are super indirect,
Yeah.
and the just the unwillingness of creating any form of disharmony really impacts to the it's very impacts to the day-to-day decisions for sure. And I think that was the hardest cycle from not hardest cycle to break, but finding
Yeah.
balance.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a
Because
it's
I
a
mean that is a thing, right? Where like there are times where you shouldn't necessarily let all of your emotions show, and sometimes where you do need to control your emotions, and then other times where it's not appropriate.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's really cool about hearing your story is you're able to you have this psychology degree, that you earned here in the United States, and you also have experiencing life in Indonesia and mental health and all of that, and you have this really cool perspective where you can really. Yeah, I'm really excited to see what you do with your master's because I mean I think you have a really cool background and you could really help a lot of people in the East and the West,
Yeah, something
both
that
places.
made me really cry. So when my mom got sick,
Hmm.
so her chemo ward was right across like the neuroscience ward.
Hmm.
And I've always, and like, her nurses ask like, oh, what do you study and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, I study like psychology. I'm like, oh, like what are you gonna do with that degree? And they're like, oh, actually, like I want to get into like clinical cross-cultural work. And then we have this conversation about what
Hmm.
depression is, and now them as like clinicians, nurses, and doctors. And I'm like, what
Yeah.
do you think about these things? You know?
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting how they still see it as a very socially constructed thing. And so I was like, oh, you don't like think like it's a brain thing? I'm like, I don't know about like no one really. It's so funny. Like in America, I feel like our brain, I guess like brain supported information is so like
Yeah.
so full, like it's
Yeah.
everywhere, and everyone's like, oh, it's your brain, it's your brain, it's your brain, it's your brain.
Hmm.
Uh, Indo's really like don't really know a lot about that. So when I start saying
Hmm.
like, oh, this is like the part of your brain that processes your emotions, this is the part of your brain that processes pain, it was like a huge shock.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay. I told Dr. Yu, I was like, is it possible for me to do it while I'm in Indo? Like I have my participants, I have my pool, I speak the language, for us to do a study to understand people's general understanding first. Like what is their
Yeah.
perceived understanding? So we did one on what I consider a mild case of mental illness because then I want to see like what is the like gray section, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was really interesting. The results show we got to present it in a conference. We're reviewing it for a publication.
Oh
It's
wow.
been it's been a while to be reviewing a publication because I have to like break it down or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, what's interesting is parents, if it's themselves that struggle with a mental illness like depression, they will see it as a social problem. But if it's their kids, they will see it as a medical problem and they will actually get medical care for their kids. So it's just
Interesting.
so weird. Like this
Yeah.
depends on who the person is. And so like that
Yeah.
project and what was really encouraging was like I remember like I think I we ended up getting almost 200 participants, which was crazy.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
I remember having a random person kind of like emailed me and they struggle with depression and they're like, for
Hmm.
you to do a study like this gave me a little bit of hope because
Wow.
I thought the things that I was thinking was just in my head.
Hmm.
And I think what's heartbreaking and hope to all the listeners out there, something that's really heartbreaking and we need to really stop about it or try to figure out something is suicide rates in Southeast Asia is one of the ones that's going up the highest actually.
Hmm.
And I think it's just really
Yeah.
sad where we are not giving access to care when suicides are also really going up. And so I don't want us to be like guilty after the fact kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the reason of why I picked this field. And it's also like, to be honest, in connection of how I met into Covenant is because I witnessed a lot of my friends went to substance abuse and all that stuff to cope,
Yeah.
and they still do until now.
Hmm.
Um, and so I just like I feel like there's a different way of life. Like there must be some kind of help, there's some
Yeah.
kind of healing and stuff like that. And Covenant, like as imperfect it is, like really helped me go through that. Like
Yeah.
both as like an Indonesian individual that has been over like having I had the worst identity crisis in like sophomore year because I'm like I don't know what
Hmm.
I am. I don't like being in
Yeah.
Asia. I don't like being in the US. I hate everywhere. That I remember very vividly.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
like w- living in such extreme parts of the world really I feel like really blossom of why I picked the field that I feel and like the work that I do now because it makes the and now what's the greatest impact like I work for a neuropsychologist like when
Hmm.
we have clients who are persons of color it's I get where they're coming from
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
like understanding of how, like the language that we should change to use or something on
Yeah.
those lines so it's just like I'm very I'm very proud to live in different parts of the world, but also being a person of color, because it
Yeah,
really does change of how you
yeah.
see things, for sure.
Well, Grace, yeah, that's awesome. That is
Sure.
really encouraging to hear. I'm super excited to see, yeah, where you go with your masters and all that you're able to achieve and all the people that you can help.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for being on the podcast. It's exciting. Thank you for speaking with me and sharing a little bit about your time in Indonesia and yeah,
And
transition
also,
to
too,
the
if
States
there's
and
any Indonesian listeners, this is my experience, so it might be a little bit different for you guys, so I apologize.
Thank you for listening to the first episode of Worn Shoes with me and Grace. I hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation. If you did, I encourage you to follow the show and share it with your friends and family. I want to thank my wife and family for encouraging me to put this together. The music for this show is done by Julian Laurie on Spotify, and the cover art was done by Josh Platts. As the show is starting off, episodes will be released at the end of every month, so please look forward to those future episodes. Also, the special announcement is that if you have an international story or experience that you would like to share, or know someone who does, please send an email to wornshoespodcast@gmail.com and potentially become a guest on the show. Again, thank you all for listening, and I will see you guys next time.